Thank you, Dirk. Just a reminder to keep Willie Foster in your prayers. She's been up and down again. We talked to her twice in the last 2 days, even this morning, and she got up this morning. She has an upset stomach, and back was killing her, and dizziness and things like this. She really wanted to be here today because she missed the last couple of weeks. So she needs your prayers. God needs to intervene in her life. She just seems to be going downhill steadily, and it's a sad thing to watch happen. But she still gets chipper when you start talking to her. If you get her on the phone for a few minutes, she'll get out of that little doldrum that she's in, and then she'll start picking up energy and start talking, getting a little more excited. There was a poem written years ago, a poem that probably each and every one of you in this room have already heard many times in your life. The title of the poem is Footsteps in the Sand. It was originally written in 1936 by Mary Stevenson. We used to have a plaque of this poem hanging in our house. I'm not sure where it is anymore. It had it engraved in some metal or something like that. I've seen it at a couple of your homes as I've visited you over the years. I've used this poem several times in sermons in the 30-plus years that I've been giving sermons, and I'm going to use it again today. So let me share this poem with you as I begin the sermon. Poem entitled, Footsteps in the Sand. One night I dreamed a dream. As I was walking along the beach with my Lord, across the dark sky flashed scenes of my life. For each scene I noticed two sets of footprints in the sand, one belonging to me and one to my Lord. After the last scene of my life flashed before me, I looked back at the footprints in the sand. I noticed that at many times along the path of my life, especially at the very lowest and saddest times, there was only one set of footprints. This really troubled me, so I asked the Lord about it. Lord, you said once that I decided to follow you, you'd walk with me all the way. But I noticed that during the saddest and most troublesome times of my life, there were only one set of footprints. I don't understand why, when I needed you most, you would leave me. He whispered, my precious child, I love you and will never leave you. Never, ever during your trials and testings. For when you saw only one set of footprints, it was then that I was carrying you. Turn with me, if you would, to Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37. All the way back there. What do we do when our lives get turned upside down? Where is God when our hopes and dreams have been shattered? We know that Jesus Christ told us that he would never leave us or forsake us. He is still around. He's still involved, and he still has purpose for our lives, even when we're in our worst trials. When we look at the lives of others, especially people in the Bible, we're reminded of this very special relationship that God and Jesus Christ have with us, and that we can in turn have with them. One of the reminders that we have, biblically speaking, is that of the life of Joseph. In Genesis 37, we're going to see Joseph was the most loved son of his father, Jacob. He was the firstborn of Jacob's beloved Rachel. In spite of everything he suffered, Joseph seems to accept God's will all through his life rather than continuously asking God, why is this happening to me? As we will see, his main concern primarily is, what can I do now? We learn from Joseph that with God's help, any situation can be turned around and used for good, even when others intend it for evil. At the time of the conflict that starts taking place in Joseph's life, he is around 17 years old. He's a young man. Let's take a look at Genesis 37. We're going to begin reading in verse 18. Joseph was hanging out with his brothers, his father's concubines' children, if you will. You know that there was a jealousy there between them and Joseph because of the way Jacob treated Joseph. He treated Joseph differently. He treated Joseph very special, and it irritated the other kids. It irritated the other sons. Joseph was even given this beautiful robe that Jacob made for him to stand out even more. There was bad blood brewing in the relationship between Joseph and his many brothers. Then Joseph does something that probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. He has a dream. And in his dream, it is shown to him that his brothers and eventually his entire family would be forced to bow down to him. He shared that dream with his brothers, which probably didn't go over real well. He shared that dream with the rest of his family. And even his father, who loved him dearly, more than any of his other children, Jacob, it even infuriated him. He was offended by Joseph sharing this kind of a dream with him and the family. Let's begin here in Genesis 37 and verse 18, where Jacob had asked Joseph to go try to find out where his brothers were because they were tending the sheep and Jacob didn't know where they were all at. Genesis 37, verse 18, now when they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. He said, this guy's getting under our skin. He's becoming a pain in the neck. And every time we turn around, now he's throwing dreams in our face, telling us we're going to bow down to him. Let's get rid of him. Then they said to one another, look, here comes the dreamer. And that wasn't the compliment. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And then we'll say to our father, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams then. These are really sarcastic, snide human beings right now. They can't stand this relationship that they have with Joseph, their father, and them. Well, they didn't kill him, but they did throw him into a pit. They took his robe off and threw him into the pit. Drop down to verse 28. But while they were eating, after they threw him into the pit, a caravan started to come by, and they had another ingenious idea. Let's make some money here instead of killing him. Genesis 37, verse 28, then the Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Then his brothers took his cloak, the special cloak that Jacob had made for him, and they poured lamb's blood on it after they butchered a lamb. And they took this bloody robe back to their father Jacob and said, we found this. Do you think it might belong to Joseph? Well, Jacob immediately knew whose robe it was, and it just killed him. Because they told him that wild animals probably captured, attacked him, killed him, ate him, and drug his body away. Jacob was really distraught over this. And you can imagine it. I mean, I can't even make myself go to the point of thinking of losing my son. It's like, you get choked up just even thinking about it. Well, this actually happened. And here's Jacob being told by these other guys who he doesn't like as much that his favorite son is now dead. Drop down to verse 34. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. I can just imagine. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Joseph was completely sick at heart. He felt like he had lost his most prized possession in life, his son. So Joseph is now a slave in Egypt. Let's go to Genesis 39. Genesis 39, just a page or two over. And we'll pick it up. Let's see here. Well, hold on here. Let me pick back up. He wept all night. Verse 36 and 37. Now the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. That was in Genesis 37, verse 36. I missed that one. I'm sorry. So he's in slavery now. He's been sold to a guy in Egypt. The guy's name's Potiphar. And he's a captain of the guard. Genesis 39 now, verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, so he's pretty high up ranking in the Egyptian scheme of things, captain of the guard and an Egyptian. He's a distinguished individual, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. Then something dramatic takes place due to Joseph's unbelievable faith, trust in God, and a heart that allowed God to work with him. Genesis 39 and verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. He's been sold as a slave. He's a slave to Potiphar. And here we've got Joseph being called a successful man as a servant to Potiphar. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Something happened once he went into this home. Once Potiphar started working with him, dealing with him, seeing him, Potiphar was impressed. Why was he impressed? Because he was living the way God wanted him to live. You don't hear any complaining from Joseph from any of this. Screaming, yelling, ranting, raving, criticizing, asking God, why me, why me? He's been thrown into a pit. He's been sold to traders. Traders sold him as a slave now to the Egyptians. Verse 3. Notice how the Egyptian Potiphar observes Joseph's behavior. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. Potiphar experienced God working with Joseph. And he saw it taking place, and it started to impress him. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. Okay, consider this. Joseph is hated by his brothers. They wanted to kill him. They decided not to kill him. They throw him into a pit. Then they decide to sell him for some money. They pull him out of the pit, sell him to these caravan. The caravan takes him to Egypt. They then take him probably down to the slave trading block. Potiphar comes up. He says, I want that young man serving in my house. He hires him. He buys him as a slave, puts him in his house. And after he's in there working in Potiphar's house, Potiphar's thinking, wow, there's something special about this kid. Keep in mind, he's only 17 years old. Now, I don't know how much time transpired from the time he threw him in the pit and the time he got to Potiphar's house. Joseph has been elevated to a leader in the Egyptians' wealth and his belongings. Then we have Mrs. Potiphar trying to get Joseph to have an affair with her. Joseph was hot. Joseph was a hunk, biblically speaking. The Bible calls him that. I mean, it doesn't actually call him that. But this guy was a good-looking dude. He was a stud. And Potiphar's wife wanted part of that stud. So she started to pursue him. And she went after him every way she could. Finally, one day, she got him cornered in the house, and she was really coming on strong. And Joseph realized this was wrong, so he turned around and ran. When he fled her house, she grabbed his coat, pulled his coat off of him, kept it on the floor, and he ran out the door. The minute he got outside the door, she started screaming, help me, he's trying to rape me. He's accosting me. This awful man attacked me. And she's just going crazy, trying to yell and scream. Well, everybody in the household heard this. So they all come to the household. They listen to what she's saying. Yeah, he tried to attack me. He's been coming on to me every time. Every time Potiphar's gone, he's coming on to me all the time. Lie, 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 lie. Well, everybody in the household believed her. This is Potiphar's wife. This is the woman of the house. And the stranger now has accosted her. Not only that, when Potiphar comes home, what does he hear from not only his wife, but everybody else in the household? This guy that you elevated to be over your whole house has now attacked your wife. Well, any man that hears that's going to get a little upset. And Potiphar got upset and really angry with Joseph. Drop down to verse 20. So he ran out. She grabbed his garment. She screamed and alerted everybody else. Her husband Potiphar comes home. She lies to him about everything, and now he's upset. Verse 20 of Genesis 39. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison. Coming after my wife, you're going into jail, boy. And he had total control over her. He was the captain of the guard. Whatever he said happened. A place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. All right, let's rehearse what's gone on in Joseph's life now. Hated by his brothers. They tried to kill him, wanted to kill him. They didn't. They threw him in a pit. They pulled him out of the pit, sold him to a caravan. The caravan sold him to Egypt. Egypt brings him on board. They elevate him to something great. The wife tries to attack him and accost him and molest him. She lies about him. Now he's thrown in jail. But watch how God stays with him and brings favor in Joseph's life once again. Verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So now he's down in the prison. The prisons back in those days were not nice places. They were actually pretty nasty. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in prison. This is like a yo-yo life. Up, down, up, down, up, down. Thrown in prison. Now he's in prison, but now he's being given charge over everybody who's in prison. Whatever they did there, it says, it was his doing. Whatever Joseph said that was going to happen in prison to those prisoners is what happened. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made prosper. Keep in mind, this is a slave. Everywhere this slave goes, he's behaving with a right heart. He's behaving out of faith. He's behaving out of trust in God. He's living his life to the best of his ability outside of his circumstances. And everywhere he goes, everybody he comes in contact with, God shows favor in their eyes. And they start seeing a characteristic about him, and they make him important among themselves. Hold your place in Genesis here. Put a marker, Genesis 39. We're actually going to be going to Genesis 41 if you want to mark it there. And go back to Romans 8. Romans chapter 8. But before we go to Romans 8 and read that, I want to share something with you. I want to share a little piece of history with you. On the night of December 9th, 1914, Edison Industries was virtually destroyed by fire. Yeah, it was Thomas Edison's company. Thomas Edison lost $2 million that night, and much of his life's worth and work went up in flames. $2 million in 1914. I can't even imagine what that'd be worth today. He was insured for only $238,000 because the buildings had been made of concrete, and at that time he thought everything would be fireproof. Edison's son Charles was 24 years old at the time, and Thomas Edison was 67. The young man ran about frantically trying to find his father amidst all these flames. Finally, he came upon him standing near the fire, his face ruddy into the glow, and his white hair blown by the December winds. My heart ached for him, Charles said. He was 67, no longer a young man, and everything was going up in flames. His entire life. He spotted me. Charles, he shouted, "Where's your mother?" "I don't know, Dad," I said. "Find her, bring her here. She will never see anything like this again as long as she lives." The next morning, walking about the charred embers of all his hopes and dreams, Edison said this: "There is great value in disaster. All our mistakes are burned up. Thank God we can start anew." 3 weeks after the fire, his firm delivered the first phonograph to the world, one of his many inventions. All his mistakes were gone. He could start over again fresh. Sounds a bit like Joseph's take on all of his situations in life, doesn't it? Things are really bad. Well, let's see where God takes this. He gets good. Things are really bad. Well, let's see where God takes this. And God blesses it. Romans 8, verse 28, one of my favorite scriptures in the Bible. "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." Joseph lived like that. Let's go back to Genesis 41 now. Genesis chapter 41. If you think about it, Paul in Romans 8:28 could have been surmising the life of Joseph in what he wrote there. Everything seemed to always be coming up roses for Joseph, no matter what the circumstances were, no matter how dire it got. Back to Joseph in prison. Not long after Joseph was imprisoned, the Pharaoh had an issue with two people in his command. His baker and his butler had done something that really ticked off the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh threw both of them into prison. Both of them, while they were in prison, had dreams, and their dreams made them depressed as a result of the dreams. Joseph is in charge of the prisoners, keep in mind. So he sees these two prisoners now dejected. They're probably not willing to do much work because they're down in the dumps. He comes up to him and he says, "So what's up? What's going on here? What's wrong?" And they said, "Well, we had these dreams and they're depressing us and we're not sure what they mean and we don't have anybody to interpret for them." And Joseph said, "You know what? Interpretations belong to God. Why don't you tell me what you dreamed and let me see if I can help you out." Remember, Joseph was called the dreamer. Well, the butler told his dream to Joseph, and it was interpreted that the butler would be released from prison in 3 days and restored to his position under the Pharaoh. Well, this thrilled the butler. Joseph asked the butler, he said, "When you're released, please put a good word in for me to the Pharaoh. I'm down here in the prison. You go up to the Pharaoh, tell him, put a good word in for me." The baker's dream, however, was different. He also, in his dream, was foretold that he was going to be released, too, in 3 days. However, after his release, he was going to be hung. Not quite the outcome that he was hoping for. Well, both happened exactly as Joseph had said they would. But when the butler went back to the Pharaoh, he said nothing on Joseph's behalf. 2 years later, the Pharaoh has a dream. He has a couple of dreams. And the dreams are really frustrating to him because they're tormenting his mind. Nobody in his kingdom could help him understand what these dreams meant. And then the butler realized 2 years ago, Joseph had helped him with his dreams. So he told the Pharaoh, he said, "I know this kid down in the dungeon. He helped me. He helped the baker. Maybe he can help you." Pharaoh calls down to the dungeon and has Joseph brought up to his quarters. He tells the dream to Joseph. He tells him the dream of the fat calf and the fat cow and the weak cow, the fat grains and the weak withered grains. Let's pick it up in Genesis 41 and verse 25. Genesis 41, verse 25. Then Joseph said to the Pharaoh, "The dreams of the Pharaoh are one." They're one and the same. "God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. And the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are the same. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years as well. And the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to the Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." He's given you a warning. "Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. You're going to have crops that are going to just be bursting at the seams. You're going to have more food than you can ever dream possible. And it's going to happen for 7 straight years. But then after them, in verse 30, 7 years of famine will arise. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. There's not going to be any way to create any food whatsoever for 7 straight years. So plenty will not be known, in verse 31, in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to the Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore, as Joseph is talking to the Pharaoh, he says, "Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint the officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of all the land of Egypt in all those 7 years of plentiful production. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of the Pharaoh. And let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which will come upon the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during this famine." He said, it's going to be so bad that if you don't do what I'm telling you to do, what God's advising you to do, everybody's going to die of starvation. So the advice was good in the eyes of the Pharaoh and in the eyes of all of his servants. Then listen to Pharaoh's statement to Joseph about his recommendation to select somebody. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Pharaoh saw something in Joseph that was so unique that God caused him to understand that Joseph had God's Spirit working with him. And Pharaoh said, "Where am I going to find a man who has the Spirit of God?" Sort of limits his choices, don't you think? So then the Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all of this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you." And once again, Joseph is raised in authority after 2 years in prison, due to his wonderful display of faith and trust in God and his heart being right all the time. Verse 40, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." In other words, the entire nation of Egypt is coming under your command. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Pretty impressive, isn't it? Then we will see how God was working out an incredible plan to actually save Israel and all of his people. None of this had to do with Egypt. It all had to do with Joseph's family. This whole scheme of things, all this, and Joseph understood this. Joseph had no idea what was going on all these years in his life. But he had always kept the faith in the sight of all the trials that he was going through, and God just kept blessing him. Verse 42, "Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He treated him as his royal son. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, before Joseph, 'Bow the knee.'" Remember what Joseph's dream was? Everybody's knee would bow to him. "So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, 'I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Whatever you say goes. The only thing you don't have jurisdiction over is my actual throne.'" Joseph had been given power over the entire land of Egypt, and anybody who entered or left Egypt, or whatever they did when they got there, was up to Joseph. What would be allowed and what wouldn't be allowed. Keep in mind, this famine was going to be widespread. It was actually throughout all the known land in that area, where his family lived as well. Now, during the next 14 years, the Pharaoh found a fine young maiden and gave her to Joseph to be his wife. And during that 14-year period of time, he had 2 children, Ephraim and Manasseh, while serving Pharaoh. But that's a whole other story that we can get into at some other time. Turn over to chapter 45 now. Chapter 45. After the 7 years of plenty, Egypt is now about the only place, it's the only place on earth you can find food. And you can imagine, God said this is a famine beyond any stretch of the imagination. Nothing would grow for 7 years. 1 or 2 years into this, everybody's going crazy looking for food. Jacob, his father, found out that Egypt had food. So what he did is he gets 10 of his sons together, he saddles them up, sends them off to Egypt. He said, "Go to Egypt and see if you can negotiate some food for us." They come to Egypt. Joseph knows it's his brothers, but his brothers don't know it's Joseph, so Joseph starts playing some mental games with them. Teasing them. Probably getting a little payback. He keeps his identity from them, but he keeps making it possible to mess with their minds. He tells them, "You can take all the food you want. I'll even give you extra donkeys if you need extra bags to haul all the food. But there's one caveat. Your little brother here, Simeon, he stays with me. I'm using him as ransom to make sure that you come back to Egypt. Because when you come back to Egypt, I understand you have a young brother. His name happens to be Benjamin. I want him in my home. So you go back to your father with all this food, letting him know I'm holding Simeon as ransom, and next time you come back to Egypt, you're going to bring Benjamin to me. They go back to Jacob with all of this food, just incredible amounts of food. And they tell Jacob what happened. Now Jacob is sick again. He lost another son. In his mind, he's lost Joseph and Simeon, and now he hears that this guy in Egypt wants Benjamin as well. I mean, we read this and then we don't think, what would that do to a father? What would that do to a mother? Giving up 3 of your children? One of them you think's dead. This was tough for him, for Jacob. It was tough for the boys. But after a couple more years, after a period of time, they needed more food again. So Jacob had no choice but to send them back to Egypt, and he had to send Benjamin with them. So he sends Benjamin back with them. They come back to the thing. Joseph's still not exposing who he is, and still's messing with him. Now he says, okay, give me Benjamin, and maybe I'll give you, maybe I won't give you Simeon. So the older brother there starts arguing. He says, I need to plead for my younger brother. Well, by this time, Joseph felt he'd seen enough. And here in Genesis 45, beginning in verse 1, he exposes who he is to them. Genesis 45, verse 1, then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried out, make everyone go out from me. He sent all of his servants out of this room where he was, where all of his 10 brothers were lined up. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud. This wasn't just a whimpering cry. He was weeping, yelling, screaming, crying because of the reunion that he had with his brothers again. He wasn't angry. He wasn't holding it over their head. He was crying out of the incredible relationship that was now being reestablished. So loud that the Egyptians in the house of the Pharaoh, everybody heard him. He wasn't quiet about it. And then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. They, first of all, probably didn't believe it was their own brother. But then second, they were thinking, if this is Joseph, he's probably going to have us killed. After what we did to him, there's no way he's not going to have us killed. So they're really unnerved by all this. But listen to the comfort. Joseph says, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? And in verse 4 he says, and Joseph said to his brothers, please come near to me. So they came near. And then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But then listen to the comfort that Joseph conveys to these brothers who plotted to kill him and who actually sold him. See, Joseph understood who was in charge. It wasn't Pharaoh. It wasn't Joseph. It wasn't his brothers. It was God. And Joseph realized this. Verse 5, but now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves. Don't keep laying guilt on yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. God had a plan all worked out, and he used me to work it out. For these 2 years of the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there is going to be remaining neither plowing nor harvesting. There's nobody going to be able to get any food out of the ground for 5 more years. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you on the earth and to save your lives by great deliverance. Guys, I'm not angry with you. I'm sort of happy when you did what you did. Because God had this thing all planned and all worked out. I got to Egypt. I'm here in Egypt. I'm in control of Egypt. I'm in control of all the food of the world. And I'm here to tell you as your brother, you are not going to starve. You are not going to go without. His dreams had come true. He wasn't rubbing their noses in it either, was he? He was actually having compassion on them. Verse 8, so now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and the Lord of all his house and a ruler throughout all of the land of Egypt. Hurry, go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and do not tarry. You need to get down here right away. This famine's not going to end. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children and your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. You bring everything in here. I will take care of it. I'll protect you, and I'll provide for you. Then I'll provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine. And behold, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. So you tell my father of all my glory in Egypt and of all that you have seen. You shall now hurry and bring my father down here. God worked it all out. God had a plan. Joseph had no idea what the plan was until it was almost at the end. The rest of the story, so to speak, is like history. In closing, let's turn to Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. Before we wrap it up today, let's take a quick peek at Stephen's speech in Acts 7. Stephen is speaking to the council, and he summarizes Joseph's faith and life as he spoke to the council, and he was there speaking to the council in his own defense. Remember how he was accused of blasphemy? And somebody wanted to have Stephen stoned. So Stephen's up there talking to the council, who were Jewish people. These are the Jewish leaders of the time. And he's reviewing the history of Israel after being accused of this blasphemy. And he's going to remind them of some of the things that took place in the past. Let's look at Acts 7, begin in verse 9. Acts 7 and verse 9. And the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. He's talking about Joseph's brothers. But God was with him, and delivered him out of all of his troubles, and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and over all of his house. Now a famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. They were going to die of starvation. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first, referring to Joseph's brothers as their fathers, their patriarchs. These were his brothers. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. They came under the protection of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people in total. So Jacob went down to Egypt, and there in Egypt Jacob died. And he and our fathers, all these patriarchs, came to Egypt with Jacob and died. And they were carried back to Shechem and laid in a tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so they may not live. That's talking about the transition from coming to Egypt to survive during the 7 years of famine. Israel and all of his family, they were planted in the land of Goshen. There was only 75 of them when they first came. They all lived and died there and stayed there and grew and grew and grew and grew till they became millions of people. They became so large that the new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, this is generations later, decided that what he was going to do is take this massive bunch of people, the Israelites, and enslave them to serve him and Egypt for 400 years. I find it interesting that Joseph's story is what led to this whole thing transpiring and taking place. This was a transition where Israel went into 400 years of slavery. What a story as it continued. But you know, Joseph is our role model for today. One of faith, one of trust, and one of confidence in God. His heart was always right, and God always made it work. Like the poem Footprints in the Sand, God carried Joseph through all those many challenges in his life, which actually became stepping stones for the future of all of mankind. Maybe like he does for each and every one of us in our lives, and we just don't know it. Have a great Sabbath.